Hey, welcome back to my channel. Something big just happened in Illinois, and it's not what it seems. When Stellantis announced it was moving production of the Jeep Compass from Canada to Belvidere.
Devastating news this morning for Ontario's auto sector and a lot of reaction. The union representing auto workers at Jeep's Brampton assembly plant says production set for that location is going to move to Illinois.
Stellantis announced its $13 billion U.S. expansion plan yesterday, leaving the future success of the province's auto sector at risk. Ford says no provincial funding will flow to Stellantis.
The headlines called it a triumph, proof that bringing jobs back to America was finally working. But behind the ribbon cuttings and speeches, something else was already breaking. Costs quietly exploded. Steel, aluminum, and transport prices climbed in sync with new tariffs. The demand for gas-powered cars, the very foundation of the plant, began to fade faster than expected. And inside the factory walls, the optimism that once filled the air was replaced by something harder to measure: uncertainty.
That the, quote, tariff uncertainty period is behind us. But for a lot of business owners, the future is still very much uncertain as they navigate this new economic era, trying to figure out exactly what it means for their businesses, their employees, their livelihoods moving forward. One Detroit auto supplier says he's going to have to lay off employees and close a warehouse because of the president's tariffs.
Stellantis has announced it is pausing production at 2 automotive plants in direct response to President Trump's tariffs.
American workers who had already been through layoffs now faced unstable shifts and rising living costs. What was supposed to be a comeback story started to look more like a cautionary tale, a move that promised strength but exposed weakness instead. So here is the question: did Stellantis really bring jobs home, or did it just bring the crisis closer? Before we dive in, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content matters. And that's where things start to unravel.
Stellantis, which is known for brands like Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, and Fiat, reporting that the U.S. president's auto tariffs have so far cost the company $480 million Canadian, as it cut vehicle shipments and some production. And the chief financial officer says the full-year tariff impact could be as much as $2.4 billion.
Because in today's auto industry, tariffs rarely travel alone. They stack. Each layer adds cost, pressure, and uncertainty until the numbers no longer make sense. By mid-2025, Volkswagen had absorbed over $1.3 billion in direct tariff costs, forcing the company to lower its profit targets. Stellantis followed with a $2.3 billion net loss after canceling several U.S. investments and flagging unmanageable trade exposure in its financial report. The problem wasn't just about cars crossing borders. It was about a system crossing its own limits. Analysts call it tariff stacking. When a vehicle faces multiple layers of import and retaliatory duties, sometimes reaching up to 37.5% once you combine base tariffs, auto-specific taxes, and reciprocal measures. The result? Every car that rolls off the line costs more before it even reaches a buyer. And modern cars make that math even worse. Electronic components now account for about 40% of a vehicle's total value, while internal combustion powertrains make up another 20%. Both among the most tariff-sensitive parts in the entire supply chain. So when the U.S. stacks tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing, it sometimes ends up taxing its own success instead. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It's how we keep uncovering what others won't say. And while those numbers sound abstract, their consequences aren't. When the costs start to climb, it's not just balance sheets that feel the strain. It's entire communities built around those factories. Belvidere used to be one of those 3-shift towns, running day and night with more than 5,000 workers in 2019. By 2022, that number had fallen, and the new reopening plan came with even deeper cuts, thinning out both skilled and non-skilled labor. The layoffs didn't stop at the factory gate. In nearby Rockford, unemployment climbed to 7.9%, the highest among Illinois' major metro areas, a visible dent in what was once the state's industrial belt. And when Stellantis announced another 400 white-collar job cuts across the U.S. in 2024, it signaled something larger. That cost discipline wasn't a phase, but a long-term adjustment stretching into 2025. Even rival automakers began to feel the tremors. Brands like Hyundai and Genesis quietly reduced service incentives instead of raising sticker prices, a subtle move that showed how production-side pressure was now rippling into the consumer market. It wasn't just a factory problem anymore. It was a regional one. a reminder that when the industrial engine sputters, every gear around it slows down too. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada chose a very different playbook. Ottawa didn't slam the table, it rewrote the fine print. Instead of emotional retaliation, it turned incentives into obligations. Companies receiving public support were now legally bound to maintain or replace equivalent jobs or face direct penalties. Prime Minister Mark Carney described Stellantis' relocation as a direct consequence of U.S. tariff escalation, but stopped short of confrontation. His demand was simple, that the company honor its commitment to the 3,000 Brampton workers whose livelihoods had been tied to the Compass Line for years. Industry Minister Melanie Joly reinforced the message, warning that Canada would use every available option, including legal channels, if corporate promises were broken. Behind her words was a clear mechanism, a countervailing tax exemption for automakers that continue producing, employing, and investing within Canada, and a 25% penalty for those who do not. It was a quiet but unmistakable signal. In Canada's industrial policy, incentives are no longer a one-way ticket out. They're a two-way contract in. But Canada didn't stop at contracts. It built a cushion. Rather than waiting for the market to self-correct, Ottawa stepped in with what officials called a bridge strategy, a web of funding, retraining, and targeted relief designed to keep workers inside the industrial ecosystem instead of letting them fall out of it. A $450 million retraining program was launched to help up to 50,000 workers transition toward next-generation manufacturing, tailored to the needs of employers rather than one-size-fits-all training. At the same time, the $5 billion Strategic Response Fund was created to help companies adapt, diversify, and enter new markets, ensuring the private sector could pivot alongside public priorities. For small and medium-sized enterprises, the often overlooked bottom-tier suppliers, regional initiatives doubled from $450 million to $1 billion over 3 years, helping them stay connected to emerging supply chains. And for those caught between layoffs and retraining, Ottawa extended employment insurance benefits by 20 weeks, covering up to 65 weeks for roughly 190,000 long-tenured workers, providing income stability while industries restructured. It wasn't a rescue package, it was a reset, a way of cushioning disruption while quietly steering the economy toward what Canada viewed as its next frontier. And while the U.S. was struggling to keep its gas-powered factories alive, Canada was already building the foundation of something new. Instead of clinging to the internal combustion engine, Ottawa poured its focus and billions of dollars into batteries and electric vehicles, positioning them not just as an industry, but as national infrastructure. At the center of that shift stood Nexstar Energy, the Stellantis-LG joint venture that received up to $15 billion in production incentives, designed as a direct counterweight to America's Inflation Reduction Act. The massive $5 billion Windsor complex, completed in October 2025, now boasts an annual capacity of 49.5 GWO and employs more than 2,500 local workers, many of them retrained from older auto plants. Just a few hours away in St. Thomas, Volkswagen's PowerCo broke ground on a $20 billion investment, calling it the national pillar of Canada's EV supply chain. Together, these two projects have effectively redrawn the country's industrial map, from a branch plant economy into a manufacturing hub with strategic autonomy. To reinforce that backbone, Ontario and the federal government added another $500 million in direct funding and pledged $13 billion in long-term production incentives to anchor-related suppliers. What began as a reaction to a factory loss had turned into a coordinated blueprint for industrial renewal and perhaps quiet competition with Washington's own ambitions. Across North America, the balance is shifting. While the U.S. doubled down on tariffs and short-term localization goals, Canada quietly secured its long game, anchoring itself in the electric future. One nation raised walls, the other built foundations, and in that contrast lies the story of who adapts and who absorbs the cost. Washington's $13 billion Made in America plan was meant to reindustrialize the heartland, but as tariffs stacked and ICE demand cooled, return on investment stretched further and further out of reach. Meanwhile, Canada traded volatility for structure. Instead of letting corporations walk away, it bound them to stay, or replace what they took, effectively turning industrial risk into contractual resilience. The result wasn't instant growth, but something rarer, stability with a direction. Because in today's economy, EVs aren't just vehicles. Their industrial infrastructure. Whoever builds the batteries doesn't just control production, they define the rules of the next economic era. And that's the real shift unfolding quietly behind the trade war headlines. If the U.S. continues to lead with tariffs before strategy, North America's supply chain may rebalance faster than anyone expects. And Belvidere could end up remembered not as a victory, but as the first warning sign. So what do you think? Is Canada's slow, legalistic approach the smarter path to long-term power, or just a temporary win before the next disruption hits? Thanks for watching. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every click fuels the truth.